Great. Merci beaucoup d'être là. Thanks for the introduction, Gilles. I will present you some progress that we've done over the past year on, like Gilles was saying, the Not Ring of Fire project, which is basically we're trying to test environmental geochemical approaches on analog sites, so not in the Ring of Fire, but to eventually support a regional assessment that will end up happening up there. So just a quick abstract. What is a Ring of Fire? It's a world-class mineral deposit up in northern Ontario. Nickel, copper, zinc, and chromium, as well as PGMs, can be found there. And one of its particularity is that it's actually located in a massive peatland system, one of the largest one in the world, which is sensitive to climate change and anthropogenic stresses. So we believe that additional knowledge on environmental conditions are required, and under this project, we're particularly interested in metalloids, presence and behavior, pre-mining. So there is no mining happening right now up there. So it is important to know what are the actual baseline of metalloids right now, how they actually move within the environment, and how potentially climate change is actually like influencing that, as well as remote anthropogenic stresses on this type of environment. So that's what we call the cumulative effect. Because we're working on analog site, we also have the possibility to have a look or a glance of what is happening post-mining initiation. So we're working on a site that is in southeastern Quebec, where there was former mines there that are actually closed for the past 70 years now. And so we can look at potential changes in groundwater flow dynamic, geochemical fate of those metalloids, and surface storage of tailings and waste rocks over time. All of that to explore and develop environmental indicators that we can adapt to the monitoring of the Ring of Fire environment. So the team is there. Those are the people that are actually working on this. A lot of people, in particular, Nicolas Benoit, who is a colleague here in Quebec and reports on all the hydrogeochemical aspect of this project, and then essentially on the post-mining analog site. Joël Marion is leading basically everything that is related to tree, and is actually leading as well and pushing our new knowledge on peat as well. In terms of activities, I would separate this in three different parts. There is the environmental archive study that is made on the pre-mining analog context. So that is in northern Quebec, in the James Bay region, next to Radisson, for people who know that. And here we're looking at different environmental archive and see if we can actually record metalloids in those ones. And today I will focus essentially on that. This is what I'm leading basically. So I will show you a bit of metalloids and lake sediments and rock sample up there, a bit of isotopic investigation on tree rings as well. Now, the hydrogeochemical study is led by Nicolas, like I said, and we did a bit of opportunistic sampling in a lake as well in there that is situated downstream of a former mine. And I will show you a little bit of that, as well as results on waste rock and tailings in terms of metalloids. And the third sub-activity would be, activity is more lab-based, and that is analytical development of the measurement of chromium speciation in water. Very complicated measurements to do, and this is led by Paul Gammon and Pierre Pelchat at the GSE Ottawa. So let's go on the pre-mining context right away. So like you can see right there, can you see my mouse actually?
Oui, on la voit.
Ah, si, okay. So Ménaric up there, James Bay region, just on the other side from the James Bay, and that would be the Ring of Fire right there. But it's a bit of a different environment, but I guess we're kind of like close. The lake is actually very narrow and long, 10-kilometer long, and the actual zone that we're interested in, the mineralized bedrock in chromium is right there. That's the peridotite. And as I presented before, we're looking at colocalized archives, so peat, lake sedimentary rings. They have different chronological scales, so they're potentially complementary. And what we're looking at is, can they record the chromium loading naturally over time, and can we link this to any climate proxy in those archives? And we're also testing and developing new indicators there, essentially indicators of forest fire intensity. And very important thing to know in those environments, because it's a vector of metalloids remobilization in the boreal forest. A couple pictures I've shown that before, just to show the field trip, the field program in 2021. And now I'm zooming right there on the actual eastern shore of Menaric Lake. You see again this purple zone that is the peridotite. Like I said, this is the mineralized bedrock that is actually outcropping at several locations everywhere. You can see all the different samples that we took right there. I just wanted to show you different type of rocks that we sample. We tried to sample all the possible type of rocks that could weather and go into the different archives. So those two would be considered, or I would consider them as sterile. You would have here more of a tonalite gabbro injected. This would be more basalt. And those here are interesting because they're actually, as I will show you later on in the presentation, ore grade rocks. So a lot of chromium and nickel in those rock right in the peridotite. I will go very quickly over there. I already presented that, and it's available on YouTube. Those are the chronologies, because obviously if we are looking at archives and we want to reconstruct the past, we need to put dates on it, but there is different ways of doing it. And we basically have very good chronologies for all the different archives we have. So that's the lake sediment, that's the peat, and that is our tree rings. Dated by counting, so it's an absolute dating, and that is done by Joël Marion. So now let's dive into the lake, no pun intended, and in the lake sediment. What you see here on this graph is, first of all, you see there is like different scale here. So all those profile actually, sorry, all those time series are not at the same scale, and you see different elements that I picked in our analysis, and you have the chronologies that we developed. So we're spanning like almost 1,000 years in those lake sediments, and basically what we can see is that for chromium, magnesium, vanadium, nickel, tellurium, antimony, and lead, we have a very nice baseline that is relatively stable up to the industrialization era in 1850. And the other thing we can see is that chromium and magnesium are actually pretty boring. They're actually not moving much, and you see a little bit of wiggle that we need to dig a little bit deeper in there, but there is not a lot of movement in chromium and magnesium in those core. If you look at vanadium, it's kind of the same thing, with maybe a little bit of increase on top, nickel, maybe a bit of wiggle at the end, and then you have those three elements here that are actually increasing quite significantly after the onset of industrialization. So I'm just going to make a little warning here. Metalloids and sediments are subject, not all of them, but some of them are influenced by diagenetic processes. So you could have artifact that would show you an increase on top of a sediment core, and that would look as an increase at the end of a chronology. Now, that said, for lead, this is not the case, and we know from a lot of studies that lead is pretty immobile in sediments once deposited. And so what we see here is something that you can see in a lot of remote locations in the world, and even in the Arctic. You would see an increase in lead up to 1960, and in the 80s, it will start to diminish. And this is attributed to long-range transport of the combustion of leaded gasoline. So that's a success story of regulation. In the 80s, the adding lead in gasoline was banned, and then we see in all sediment core that only record lead input from the combustion of gasoline, you'll see a decrease after the 80s. I would note, though, that we're not back to pre-industrialization baseline, but we're on our way. Antimony and tellurium, it's interesting to see that they're increasing as well. We'll have to reinforce make sure that there is no diagenetic effect on those two before making any conclusions. Chromium and magnesium, there is clearly a link with the bedrock mineralogy. They follow each other, so they're coming from the same source, but they're not moving that much. What is also interesting, I suppose, for chromium is that it's naturally above guidelines, but it's natural. On the tree now in the same region, so next to Ménaric, I'm showing you here a curve of the delta C13, so isotopic abundance of C13 in tree rings. This is the orange curve, and it actually follows pretty well the increase in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, giving us a pretty good proxy for that. The other interesting fact is that you see a pretty strong C13 enrichment anomaly here in 1989. And this is related to an actual forest fire that we can validate with dated fire scar here on the wood, on trees. And basically, it's a loss of foliage, so a loss of efficiency of photosynthetic efficiency, sorry. And so you would fractionate less your C13 during photosynthesis, and you will see this enrichment anomaly. So it's a good proxy to pinpoint very well forest fire in the region. Now we'll go on the post-mining context. So here we're in southeastern Quebec, next to Tetford mines, region known for asbestos mining. But before that, there was some chromite mining. And we visited two former mines, Ried Bélanger right there, and Montreal mine here. Ried Bélanger is characterized by a lot of tailings situated on the surface. Montreal mine would be way more visible waste rock on the surface. And it's also, interestingly, upstream of Petit Lac Saint-François, the lake I told you we opportunistically sampled. And this is the connection with Ruisseau Chrome. So this is the work of Mike Parsons. He actually very nicely sampled a lot of different representative type of waste rock and tailings in the area. And some of them are represented here. You can see a little crust here on those dunite waste rock, which is basically a weathering rind. And you have here as well, like actual chromite residue here. Same here, chromite bands and like the dunite. Here you have the serpentinite, a very classic rock of the area, very beautiful rock, but it's a waste rock in that case. And then we have different types of tailings at the Ried Bélanger mine. You see this lunar landscape that is actually partially like overgrown with vegetation here. If you dig a hole, you see tailings at the bottom, and you see even like a layering of different hard pans if you dig into it. So in terms of bulk metal content in those tailings and waste rock, just note here the logarithmic scale. You have quite a bit of variation in the waste rock from Montreal mine and Ried Bélanger, but basically in the same range than the Ménaric bedrock that you can find that is not mineralized. The tailing is a bit less variable, and that makes sense since it has been processed more extensively. And then you have those outlier here. Those are the rocks I showed you in one of the first slides. Those are the ore grade. We're up to 20% weight percent of chrome in there. So that's probably like the concentration from which we started, and then it got extracted, and we arrived at those waste rock at Ried Bélanger and Montreal mine. For nickel, it's very similar, except that we're actually enriching a bit the nickel in the actual tailings, which again makes sense. That was not the element of interest. So after extraction, you enrich it in the residual rock. And again, this outlier here is ore grade from Ménaric. Now, if we look at the lake sediment archive, again here, what is striking is that we have a very nice baseline, and we're able to reconstruct that up to the industrialization. And then everything goes up and gets like all entangled, and we don't see anything. So that's, to me, is a textbook case of cumulative effect that we actually can disentangle in a lake sediment core. So we have to zoom in a little bit on that. And what we see is that in the between the Second and the First World War, you have a peak in tellurium, antimony, magnesium, chromium, nickel, and some of the shoulder in lead. And then some of them will decrease after, not reaching background, but still decreasing. And some of them will continue to increase. And notably, the lead that I was telling you the story before continues to increase until the 60s or so, and then starts to decrease. So we have an initial phase where we have peak mining that is documented at Montreal Mine between World War I and World War II. And then you see a decrease, but for lead, we continue to increase that because of the leaded gasoline atmospheric input. Another thing that is interesting, beside the fact that it doesn't go back to baseline, is the vanadium. And here I will be very careful with what I said because I need to dig into that a little bit deeper. But my theory is the fact that we look at vanadium going up later with a delay is maybe due to the fact that we're increasing in North America the part of heavy oil that is going into the cocktail of fossil fuel that we're burning. And vanadium is something that we actually find enriched in heavy oil, such as bitumen, for example.
Temps de conclure.
Yeah, and that's it. I'm done with that. I was just showing this nice wetland here at Montreal Mine. The fact that we still see a bit of a chromium coming into the lake in recent time could be due to the fact that we have this little stream that is cross-cutting and maybe like eroding what is underneath this very idyllic wetland. And this is this type of gray sediment. Still have to do a bit of geochemistry on this. It's a bit interesting what we see, but that's one of the things we have to do. So with that, I'm done. If you want to know more about everything about hydrogeochemistry, you can look at this presentation and anything that Nicolas has done under the groundwater geoscience program. Thanks for your attention.